神的儿女们，大家平安。
And peace to all the children of God.
感谢天父真神赐给我们美好的安息圣日。
And praise and thank God for blessing us with such a wonderful and beautiful Sabbath day.
借着安息圣日，我们可以共同来学习圣经神的话语。
So that on this blessed holy Sabbath day, that all of us can gather here to study the Word of God.
这件事情对我们来说非常重要。
And this indeed is a very important matter for us.
因为我们人生都一直不断的在长进。
Because we go through different phases of life and we keep growing.
应该有听人家说过。
And I'm sure that you probably have heard some saying
人生要不断的进步。
that we must always progress in our lives.
尤其在这种属灵生命的成长。
And especially in the development of our spiritual life.
如果没有进步，就是退步了。
If we don't improve, then we are regressing.
所以，我记得小时候这个学生大家都在写一些互相祝福或者是勉励的话。
And I remember when I was a youth, many of the students, they will write words to encourage and bless one another.
就是说呢，你如果没有进步，就是退步了。
That is to say, if you don't improve, then you are actually regressing.
确实，我们属灵的人生的生活没有进步，真的就是退步。
So that also applies to our spiritual life. If we don't take one step forward, then we are actually one step backward.
我想我们最近都一直在读旧约圣经。
And I believe that recently we've all been reading the Old Testament.
从旧约圣经里头会发现一件事情。
And from the Old Testament, we will discover a certain matter.
不晓得大家有没有发现一个问题？
I'm not sure whether you actually discover this problem in the Old Testament.
因为以色列百姓他们都是应着景象的百姓。
And because the Israelites, they are a nation that is stiff-necked.
所以从摩西或者众祭司先知，他们一直在劝勉。
And so therefore, from the advice of Moses and also all the prophets,
很难看出他们的进步。
it was very difficult to find the advancement of the Israelites.
那为什么会这样？
Then why is that so?
因为从这个旧约的圣经我们可以发现一件事实。
Because from the Old Testament, we will discover a certain matter.
以色列百姓他们在对神的追求或者敬拜事上。
And that is the fact in terms of how the Israelites, how they worship God and pursue after God.
他们对神只追求眼见。
What they pursue after God is only the blessings that they can see.
不是追求信心。
And they are not actually pursuing after advancing their faith.
那今天在新约时代就不一样了。
But however, today in the New Testament era, we are different.
我们不能停留在这种眼见的生活环境。
And no longer should we dwell upon just the visual blessings that we can receive in our life.
一定要去追求那种属灵信心，没有见你就相信的那种信心。
But rather, we must pursue after the faith that is invisible, that is in the spiritual realm.
这种信心说真的要建立也不简单呐。
But however, indeed, it is a huge challenge to establish an invisible faith.
真的确实没有追求那种属灵的智慧，真的很难去建立。
And that is to say, if we don't truly pursue after spiritual wisdom, it will be very difficult to build up a life of faith.
所以下午呢，我们要用真智慧的人生来做学习。
So that is why this afternoon, the topic for our study is living with true wisdom.
我们一样要根据耶利米先知所讲所勉励的一段话。
And again, we are going to emulate after this verse spoken by the prophet Jeremiah.
我们来看耶利米书的17章。
Let's all turn to Jeremiah 17.
耶利米书17章
Jeremiah 17,
第5节开始，
starting from verse 5.
我们从第5节来读到第8节。
And let's read from verse 5 to verse 8.
英语华语我们都可以一起来读。
Chinese or English version, let's read it all together.
第5节预备
Verse
起。
5.
神如此说
Thus says the：
倚
Lord,
靠人
Cursed
血
is
热
the
的
man
膀
who
臂，
trusts in man
心
and
中
makes
离弃
flesh his
神
strength,
的
whose
那
heart
人有
departs
祸
from the
了。
Lord.
因
For
他
he shall be
必
like a
像
shrub
沙
in
漠
the
的
desert,
杜松，
and shall not see
不
when
见
good
湖的
comes,
来到，
but shall
却
inhabit
要
the
住
parched
在
places
旷
in
野
the
干旱
wilderness,
之处，
in the salt
无人
land
居住的
which is
碱
not
地。7节，
inhabited.
依靠
7.
神，
Blessed is the man who trusts in the
以
Lord,
神为
and
可
whose
靠
hope
的
is the
那
Lord.
人有福。8
Verse
节，
8. For
他
he
必
shall be
像
like a
树
tree
栽于
planted
水
by the
旁，
waters,
在河
which
边
spreads
扎
out its
根，
roots by the
炎
river,
热来
and
到
will not fear when
并
heat
不惧
comes,
怕，
but his
叶
leaves
子
shall
能
be
必青
green,
翠，
and will not
在
be anxious
干
in the
旱
field
之
of
年
drought,
毫
nor
无
will
挂虑，
cease from
而且
yielding
结果不
fruit.
止。阿门。
Amen.
刚才所看的就是神透过先知耶利米来勉励以色列百姓。
So the verses that we have just read are the words of encouragement by God through the mouth of the prophet Jeremiah.
神知道以色列百姓的这种软弱，
God understood the weaknesses of the Israelites,
所以才不断的透过众先知来对以色列百姓做勉励。
and that is why God sent many prophets to encourage Israelites.
因为神他知道这些百姓真的只有那种看外表、注重外表的那种信仰生活，
Because God, He understood that the Israelites, they are only dwelling on the surface of visual blessings that they can see in their life.
我们早上有读过耶利米书的12章啊，
And this morning we have just read chapter 12 of the book of
我
Jeremiah.
们可以再回顾一下12章的第2节啊。
And let's review once again Jeremiah chapter 12, verse 2.
先知对以色列百姓这么说，
And the prophet spoke to the Israelites
说神来栽培了众以色列百姓，
that God has planted all the Israelites.
众以色列百姓也扎了根，
And yes, they have also taken root.
也看到他们的长大，
And yes, they also grow up.
也看到他们的结果，
And yes, they also bear fruit.
也看到他们的口与神来相近。
And yes, they are also near in their mouth.
从刚才所看的这些都很正常，
So from what we have just seen, all these facts are very normal.
那接下来就不正常了。
But then there is a twist over here.
我们再看
Let's continue.
最后的那一句：
The last verse.
心却远离，心却与你远离呀、
But they are far from their mind from God.
那如果心远离了神，那这些百姓到底是什么样啊？
So if your heart has turned away from God, is far from God, what would you become?
有体无魂呐、
That is to say, you have the body without the soul inside.
如果以今天形容来说，
So if we were to use our description today,
以色列百姓变成稻草人呐、
that is to say, the Israelites, they have just become mere haystacks.
以我们可以明白的说了，就是假人呐、假的人呐、
Or you can put it in another way, they are just fake people.
那假人呢，那对神等于是假信仰。
And they are fake in terms of their faith towards God.
神看到这些百姓一定很伤心啊！
So when God looked at these Israelites, he must be very sorrowful.
我用一个形容比较会明白，
And if we use another description to further clarify,
比如我们自己生、我们自己养的儿女，
take for example the children that we bring them up,
天天来纠缠在父母亲的身旁，
and every day they come and mess around the parents,
没有钱了，爸爸妈妈我要钱。
and they say that, well, I'm short of money, daddy and mommy give me money,
可是呢，他们的心呢，根本就没有在父母亲的身上，
but yet their heart is not connected to their parents.
因为心没有在家，
And because their heart is not true,
因为他们的心跟着父母是相违背的。
and that is to say, their heart is contrary to their parents.
好，如果今天你生的、你养的这种儿女的话，
So today, if these are the children that you have,
你会高兴吗？
would you be happy
还是难过呢？
or would you be sad?
你们自己想想看。
So just think about this.
如果你养的就是这种儿女，
If these are the kind of children that you have brought them up,
心一定非常难过，
then your heart will be very, very sorrowful.
不是难过，痛苦，
And beyond sorrow, you will even feel pain.
甚至气，甚至说不要生你。
You'll be so angry and so frustrated, you will probably regret that you bring them into this world.
如果严重的说，我早就把你掐死算了啦，养你这么大有什么用啊？
And you may be so angry to the fact that should have strangled you while you were a kid, and instead of letting you grow up to this point.
因为这个儿女让父母亲很伤痛，很难过。
Because such a kind of children, they bring sorrow to the heart of their parents.
但愿我们的家的孩子都很听话，很乖，
And we hope that the children in our family, that they are all obedient,
不会让我们伤心，不会让我们难过，不会让我们掉眼泪。
that they will not bring sorrow and sadness or even tears to our eyes.
如果你有这样的希望，那你怎么做呢？
So if you have such a kind of hope, what should you do?
你现在赶快做，不能太慢了。
And you must take action now before it's too late.
到底怎么做？
What should you do?
所以下午就是要追求真智慧的人生来做一种追求。
And so therefore this afternoon, we are going to look into how we should pursue true wisdom in life.
带领我们的儿女来追求真智慧。
And that is to bring our children so that they can also pursue after true wisdom in life.
以色列百姓他们就没有追求真智慧，
And we look at the Israelites, they did not pursue after true wisdom.
所以刚才我们读的耶利米书的17章啊，
So that is why when we come back to Jeremiah chapter 17,
在第5节这边就开始说了，
and starting from verse 5, it
So-
says,
神来向先知说话，
And so the Lord spoke through the prophet,
依靠人血肉的膀臂啊，
that cursed is the man who trusts in man,
心中离弃神的
and whose heart departs from the Lord,
那人有祸。
that this man shall be cursed.
先知就直接明讲，
So the prophet says over here very clearly,
为什么要明讲？
why does he clarify this
好话
point?
讲的都不听啊，
Because they've already spoken all the good words of
只
encouragement.
有讲重话。
Then now the tone becomes very serious.
这是受到很严重的打击、难过才这样子表示。
And it is because after they are being provoked to anger, that is why the words of seriousness will come in.
然后第6节继续用一种植物来做描述，
And then from verse 6 on, it talks about an analogy of a plant.
这个描述这个以色列百姓啊，
And it describes the Israelites,
这是第6节。
verse 6,
这些以色列百姓会像沙漠的杜松。
that the Israelites, they shall be like a shrub in the desert.
我们想想，沙漠本来是很空旷、没有生命的一个环境啊。
So think about the environment of the desert. It is very vast, empty, and has nothing.
在里头竟然有杜松啊！
But yet, within it, you can actually 有什么杜松？
杜松啊，就是这个杜松。
什么东西？
杜
Oh, you can actually find the shrub.
哦，
这个杜松。You can
所以
actually find the
所以
shrub.
这个杜松可以说只在沙漠它可以存活。
And that is to say, this kind of shrub can only live in the desert.
以植物性来讲，它是一种碱性。
So that is to say, if you look at the plants kingdom, they are actually very passive.
以生长环境来说，它是可以不用水的一个环境。
And that is to say, these kind of shrub, they can live in an environment without water or very little water.
我根据那些说明这是一些那个 Google 来说明杜松那个介绍杜松啊。
So therefore, when we Google the word shrub and to find out their description,
杜松它是鳞片很小，
and so if you look at the shrub, the blade of their leaf has a very small area.
它就会在那个沙漠那边生活。
And so that is why they can dwell and live in the desert.
那还有呢，就是描述说这个杜松根本就是光溜溜了，什么都没办法去繁殖，没有去生长的那种生活条件啊。
And also another description described these shrub as actually having a very little outward appearance, and they need very little in order to survive in the desert.
所以这个是 对以色列百姓的一种形容啊。
So that itself is a description of the Israelites.
这个呢，杜松呢，他不见福的来到啊。
So this shrub, they shall not see when good
那
comes.
杜松就是喜欢，也不是说喜欢的，就是在那种旷野沙漠中去存活了。
And these shrubs, they shall inhabit the parched places in the wilderness.
所以圣经记载说，住旷野干旱之处啊。
And that is why these shrubs, they shall inhabit the parched places in the wilderness.
甚至居住在无人居住的那个碱地啊。
And they certainly are able to inhabit in the salt land that no one can dwell.
这个是形容以色列百姓这个太吝啬就是没有那种施舍，没有这种怜悯的心啊。
And so this is describing the Israelites. Their heart is very hard. It is not merciful and compassionate.
也等于是说，这些百姓啊，以色列百姓真的太不像话。
And it's also describing the Israelites as people that are really not living up to par to the standard of God.
所以从这些圣经的记载，可以让我们了解了。
So from the Bible description, we can understand
一个有追求真智慧的人，应该不会像杜松，应该不会像以色列百姓。
that is to say, a person who's pursuing after true wisdom, they will not become like a shrub in the desert.
所以今天我们在这种信仰生活的这个上面啊，
So therefore today, when we view our spiritual life,
我们要去追求那种属灵的这个追求。
we need to pursue after true spiritual wisdom.
因为我们所看重的就是属灵的信仰生活。
Because what we focus on is to advance our spiritual life.
因为今天我们所追求、所走的就是属灵的道路上面。
And because today all of us, we are walking along this journey of faith.
既然知道我们是追求属灵的信仰生活，
And since we all have this common goal to pursue after advancing our faith,
当然呢，在这里头我们就不会像以色列百姓，
then of course we will not be likened to the Israelites at all.
也不会像刚才所说的这个杜松的那种生活条件。
And also we will not be likened to the shrubs in the desert.
所以这个就是属灵的生活不一样的地方。
So that is the disparity, the difference between the different kind of spiritual
那
lives.
今天呢，我们在信仰上的追求，
And also today, when it applies to the advancement of our spiritual life,
其实我们今天的人生不是在注重去看重个人的成败，
so very often we are not actually looking at the success or failure of a person's life,
应该也不是在乎于他工作的高与低，
or the social status of their career in this world,
也不是在看重于他的学业有多大的成就，
or looking at the level of their education.
甚至这种属灵的生活呢，也不必去说我战胜、我打败了多少这个敌人、撒旦魔鬼。
And also, we should not measure our spiritual life as in terms of the numbers of victory that we have won over the battle with the devil.
所以今天我们的信仰生活，说真的，只在乎追求属灵。
But rather, the key focus of our spiritual life is to focus in terms of advancing, improving our spiritual life.
那问题呢？我们如何去追求这种属灵的生活呢？
Then, however, the question comes back. How do we actually go about it, pursuing after our spiritual life?
所以从耶利米先知对我们所勉励的话，
So from the words of encouragement from the prophet Jeremiah,
真的我们要去追求啊！
that indeed it is true that we must pursue.
我们再看回到耶利米书的17章，
Let's come back to Jeremiah 17,
17章的第7节
verse 7.
这边就告诉我们该如何去追求这种生活。
So over here, it tells us how we should pursue after such an abundant life.
第7节这里就说了
Verse 7, it says,
说倚靠神的，甚至以神为可靠的那人有福了。
verse 7, blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose hope is the Lord.
所以从先知告诉我们的话，
So from the words spoken by the prophet,
一个追求属灵的人的信仰生活，
and a person who pursue after advancing their spiritual life,
应该重点在于 他的对神的依靠。
And the key point is their trust in the Lord.
因为刚才我们已经看到第7节所描述的，
And as what we have just read in terms of the description,
以神为可靠的那个人有福了。
that blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord.
所以从这边就告诉我们，
So from this passage, it let us understand
在我们一生啊，也就人生的追求上面啊，
that in terms of our lifelong pursuit and our life goal,
应该说你是否全然依靠神？
and that is to say, we must put our life plan with total reliance upon the Lord.
如果你有全然依靠神，
If you completely rely upon the Lord,
这种人就不简单了。
then this person will be very, very blessed.
这种人就是属于求属灵智慧的真智慧人。
Because this person would not be simple after all. They are the ones who actually pursue after true wisdom.
我刚才讲过，以色列百姓啊，他们只重看外表，
As I've spoken earlier, the Israelites, they only focus on the visual blessings that they want.
这个等于是旧约时代的一种信仰生活。
And that is the kind of spiritual life that they led in the Old Testament times.
那今天我们在新约时代，
But today we are living in the New Testament
我
times.
们一定要抛开过去旧约时代他们的这种信仰观念，
That is to say, we must cast aside the concepts that bind them in the Old Testament times.
要本着信心来向神做祈求、做依靠。
And that is, we must rely upon our faith and focus upon God and pursue after our faith.
所以从这边就告诉我们，
That is why this passage let us know
我们为了要追求追求那个真智慧的人生啊，
that in order to lead a life that pursues after true wisdom,
所以我们就懂得去追求这种属灵的智慧。
so that we will know how and understand how to pursue after true spiritual wisdom.
那根据先知以利米对我们所勉励的话，
According to the passage of encouragement by Prophet Jeremiah,
足有依靠神啊。
we can only trust
不
in
过
the Lord.
不过以现在人来讲呢，他本着自己的智慧、自己的判断，
But for most people nowadays, they just based upon their own intelligence, so to speak.
所以现在人说：“你看这个是什么时代了，还这么迷信啊
And they use their worldly wisdom and education saying that, well, you are so superstitious in this modern world.？”
所以有一些人就打胸脯说：“你看，我靠我自己啦。”
And so many people, they will actually beat upon their chest and say that, I can only rely upon myself.
那个另外有钱的人说：“你看，我是靠我的钱呐、
And then look at those rich people, they say that, well, I have my money to fall back on.
那现在有一些人呢，他人脉广大，我把所有的我的人脉全部把它招过来。
And then there are other people who has a very well social network. They can use all their social network for their friends.
所以这个时代有这个时代人的缺点。
So these are all the human weaknesses of this modern era.
其实人很软弱，
In fact, we human beings, we are very weak.
其实人的能力很有限，
And in fact, our abilities are also very limited.
其实人的知识不懂，看不清楚自己。
And also, we do not have that self-awareness or even self-knowledge of our own identity.
所以从我们的个人的这种读书呢会养成我们一种只依靠自己的这种心理。
And because based upon our education, we are taught to just rely upon ourselves.
那今天我们在信仰生活上面的追求，
But however, today, in terms of advancing our spiritual life,
我们已经从圣经得到启示了，
we have already received the revelation from the words of God in the Bible.
懂得依靠神成为我们一生的大事。
It let us know that we must trust in the Lord in order to be blessed.
所以今天我们这种依靠的生活上面
So in terms of relying upon God in our lives,
是一种事实，实在的。
it is a fact.
因为我们 说真的，我们不能只有自己呀、
Because it is so true that we cannot just have ourselves.
问题你在这种不是只有靠自己的这种理念上，
And so therefore the question is, in terms of this concept of self-reliance,
其实在这种不是说我不需要别人，
so it doesn't mean that you don't need other people.
因为说真的，我们也需要有一些我们的同工，有需要我们的朋友从旁边来做一种互相的帮助。
And that is to say, we also need the assistance and the help from the friends around us.
所以这种帮助跟依靠是不一样的。
So this kind of help from friends and your own self-sufficiency, they are different.
刚才我们已经读过那个耶利米书的17章的第5节啊，
And just now we have just read Jeremiah 17 verse 5.
这边就提到以色列百姓他们的软弱，
Here it speaks about the weaknesses of the Israelites.
他们依靠人血肉的膀臂。
That is to say, they trust in man and make flesh their strength.
刚才从周边的人帮助跟依靠是不一样的。
And because if they rely upon all the friends, it is totally different from relying upon God.
这个血肉的膀臂表示说一种能力的彰显。
Over here, to make flesh your strength, it portrays the ability of the flesh.
所以这种血肉的膀臂就是一种暴力啊。
And so you can also interpret it as a kind of violence when man makes flesh their strength.
所以周边的帮助跟暴力的帮助是不一样的。
So the help that you get from people and also the help that you get from a kind of violence, it is very different.
所以呢，我们懂得来依靠我们，我们可以依靠的那种追求。
And so we must know what kind of true reliance that we should have.
但是从刚才我们所看过的耶利米书17章的第5节来说，
But from verse 5 of the passage chapter 17 of the book of Jeremiah,
我们绝对不能靠着人的血肉这个膀臂，
and that is to say, we must not make flesh our strength.
因为人的这种势力、人的力量是容易被改变的，
And because if we trust in the strength of man, that can change any time.
甚至也很容易就衰退了。
And it will also regress over time.
所以呢，今天呢，我们要懂得，你依靠要有正确的对象啊。
And so therefore we must know the right direction in terms of our reliance.
从刚才我们所读的耶利米书的17章第5节跟第6节这里所看到的，
And from passage verse 5 and 6 that we have just read in the book of Jeremiah 17.
这边对我们所说的就是依靠人啊。
So over here it says that for those who trust in man,
依靠人有依靠人的缺点，
and of course there are shortcomings in terms of trusting in man.
人一变了，一切都变了，
Once that person has changed, there goes your reliance.
甚至包括你的依靠也都变了，
And even your reliance upon that person will also be changed.
甚至呢会让你后患无穷啊。
And sometimes it will even give you even more problems instead.
即使你靠人让你得到好处啊，
So perhaps you may reap some advantages in terms of trusting in the strength of man.
说真的，你也许等一下想想，到底这个会不会带来我某方面一种威胁啊？
But you must also balance the situation and ask yourself, are you endangering yourself by putting yourself into such a situation?
因为转过身来，他也怕怕的，
Because when you turn around, you may have fear in your heart,
不知道他有没有什么野心啊？
because you don't know actually the motive of the other person who helped you.
尤其现在这个诈骗特别多，
Especially there's so many scamming going around.
哇，他帮助我这么多，又说有这么多好处，等一下是不是会来跟我要什么东西啊？
And because we hear so many stories of people who helped you, and then they turn around and you think that they are going to rip you out.
所以在有时候在那个福音茶会要特别小心来了是不是在追求真道啊？
And so that also applies to our gospel tea fellowship. the friends that we bring, are they genuinely and truly seeking after the truth?
是不是他另有存着不好的心呢、
Or perhaps they may harbor other kind of intention when they come.
所以说真的啊，有时候人啊，他思想一改变，什么都变了。
Because we know that when the concept of man changes, their mind changes along.
所以当人靠人的时候啊，
So if you rely upon another man,
有时候因着他的心一偏离神什么都改变了。
and once their heart go astray from God, then that will change everything.
所以到最后只有痛苦啊。
Then at the end, you are the one who suffer all the pain left.
那我们从耶利米书的17章的第7节跟第8节这里告诉我们一件事实。
And so in terms of moving along this passage, Jeremiah 17, verses 7 and 8,
那这边告诉我们就是说，我们要懂得来依靠神，
so it tells us that we must know how to rely upon God.
因为今天我们在信仰上的追求，
Because today, in terms of our pursuit of our spiritual life,
我们这个所敬拜的神，他是永生又信实的神啊。
because the God that we worship, He is a steadfast and trustworthy God.
他的力量是无限的，
And His power is infinite.
他是永远可靠的。
And He is completely reliable.
所以这个就是依靠神的好处啊。
That itself is the advantage of relying upon the Lord.
所以在第7节的最后一句那么说了，
That is why in the latter verse of verse 7,
说依靠神的人，那人有福了。
that blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose hope is the Lord.
这就是告诉我们说，我们要懂得来依靠神。
So that is telling us that we must know to trust in the Lord.
在这个大卫王的时代啊，
And during the times of King David,
这个大卫王啊，他年轻的时候，跟一般的人是一样啊。
and King David, when he was young, he was just likened to any other boy.
我们应该都知道他的故事。
And all of us probably is very familiar with the story of King David.
他小时候在牧羊啊，
And when he was a youth, he was shepherding the flock.
所以在撒母耳记上的17章啊，
So that is why in 1 Samuel 17,
17章的47节这边提到大卫啊，来向这个非利士人来做一种应对啊，就是为了要来帮以色列百姓啊，去跟这个非利士人来打仗的这件事情啊。
and so over here, this passage, it described the story of how David faced the Philistines in terms of the battle of the Israelites against the Philistines.
当时以色列百姓他们啊，只有大卫啊，他靠神啊。
And at that time, among all the Israelites, only David know how to rely upon God.
问题呢，遇到了非利士人这么强壮又这么善战，
And the question is, when they face the Philistines, who are such great warriors in their time,
当中又有一个很高壮的歌利亚，
and among the Philistines, there was an outstanding warrior named Goliath.
所以整个以色列百姓都怕死了。
So of course, that casts a great fear upon all the Israelites.
所以在42节这里的大卫他就出去来面对非利士人呐、
So over here, it describes how David went ahead and went out to face Goliath.
我们来看45节，
Let's look at verse 45.
17章的45节。
1 Samuel 17:45.
大卫对非利士人说了：“你来攻击我是靠着刀枪啊和铜戟啊，我来攻击你是靠着耶和华神的名啊，就是你所辱骂带领以色列军队的神呐、
Verse 45, Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied.
大家怕，只有大卫不怕。
Everyone is full of fear, but only David is not afraid.
甚至就跟他讲说：“我是靠天上的神的。”
And David is so bold as to say that I am the one who rely upon the God above.
当时很年轻的大卫，他不怕这个歌利亚，
At that time, David was so young, but he was not afraid of Goliath at all.
所以一下子就把大卫呢，就用那手中的那个弹弓，就把那个歌利亚就把他打死了。
And so that is why we see how David, just with a mere sling in his hand, he was able to struck Goliath down.
所以大卫才说呢，说你看你都靠着这种武器啊，刀剑啊。
And so that's why David spoke to Goliath, you rely upon your spear and your javelin and your weapons.
就是刚才所说的以色列百姓一样是靠着人肉的这种武器这种力量去应对敌人啊。
So that also applies to the Israelites. They rely upon the flesh and the strength of man in terms of their battle against the enemies.
大卫是靠神，
But yet, David, he relied upon the Lord.
所以一下子就打胜仗了。
That is why he was able to gain victory over the battle.
所以从这里就告诉我们了，
That is why over here it let us understand
懂得依靠神的心中就享有平安了。
that if you know to rely upon the Lord, you will enjoy peace in your heart.
他的生命就丰盛了，
Then your life will become abundant
因为从天上得到神的帮助，
because you are receiving the help from the heavens above.
这种帮助是无限量的，
And this kind of help is infinite
而且是永远可靠，
and that it is definitely everlastingly reliable
永远不改变，
and you will never ever change
永远正确。
and you will definitely be correct.
所以今天我们从这个耶利米先知来对以色列百姓所教导的话，
So therefore, when we look at the passage of encouragement that Jeremiah gave to the people of Israel,
也让我们了解到我们要懂得来依靠神。
it also teaches us that today we must know to rely upon the Lord.
如果我们懂得来依靠神的话，
So if we know how to trust in the Lord,
我们在人生里头就会永远得胜啊！
then in terms of our lives, we will always be victorious.
所以今天呢，我们从这个大卫他的经历成为一种能力的见证。
So therefore, from the story of David, it itself gives a testimony of his trust in God.
所以今天我们在信仰上的生活，
That is why when it applies to our daily lives today, in terms of our Christian walk,
我们如果有这种属灵的真智慧的追求，
if we truly have this pursuit of true wisdom in our lives,
你的人生就会像大卫王那样，
then your life will be likened to King David.
你的人生就会像耶利米先知来勉励以色列百姓。
Then your life will be like the words of encouragement by Jeremiah the prophet.
把神成为一生可靠的，必然得福了。
And because you put God as your complete trust and reliance in your life.
所以呢，今天呢，我们懂得这种信仰的道理啊，
So today, if we understand this truth,
应该我们要把这种信心拿出来。
so then the next thing for us to do is to bring forth this faith within us.
能够在神的面前来表示我们对神的依靠。
And so that we come before God and show him that we have him as our total trust.
我们来求神来悦纳我们的信心，
And we come before God to ask him to take delight in our faith.
而且这种蒙神的悦纳是永远有效的。
And if God is delighted in us, we will have favor for the rest of our lives.
不在这种依靠的事上，有时候也会因着人某方面的失误而造成了一种试探、
But
试炼啊。
But sometimes, in terms of relying upon God, we must also realize that there may be trials waiting ahead of us.
我接下来来提几个依靠神而产生了试炼的这个问题。
And then, so now I'm going to raise some questions in terms of relying upon God and the trials that we face.
第一件
The first point,
就是当人在危急的时候，
that is when we are facing danger in a dangerous situation,
结果神的拯救没有到达，
and then we find that the deliverance of God did not come upon us.
这个讲的是在讲谁呢？
So who are we talking about?
就是在讲扫罗。
So we are talking about Saul.
我们在旧约圣经这个撒母耳记上有这么一段记载，
And in the Old Testament, in the book of 1 Samuel, there is this passage,
在撒母耳记上的13章，
1 Samuel chapter 13.
这13章里头在记载扫罗他年轻跟这个 这个撒母耳他们约定时间，
So over here it talks about Saul when he was young, and he had an appointment with Samuel the prophet.
在撒母耳记上的13章啊，
In 1 Samuel chapter 13,
第8节开始啊，
starting from verse 8.
这边在描述扫罗是照着跟撒母耳所约定的日期，结果这个扫罗就等了7日。
And so over here, verse 8, he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel.
结果呢，这个撒母耳就还没有到达，
But yet Samuel did not come.
扫罗就看到百姓就一一的离开了。
Then Saul find out that the people were scattered from him.
所以扫罗那个时候他就心里慌张就自己献祭。
And so Saul became anxious in his heart, and he decided to offer the burnt offering himself.
当扫罗献祭完了以后，撒母耳就出现了。
And after Saul finished offering the burnt offering, then Samuel appeared.
结果因为这件事情，扫罗就得罪神了。
And then because of this event, Saul, he has transgressed against God.
所以这个就是我们要本着那个信心啊。
So this story let us understand that we must rely upon our faith.
然后在这个信心里头，我们也要本着我们该尽的本分。
And within this faith, we must also carry out our duty.
你是王，你不可以献祭啊。
You are a king, you are not allowed to offer offerings.
所以要各尽其职。
So that is to say, as a king, you should exercise your kingly duties.
所以扫罗呢，他慌张了，就做错事了。
But yet Saul, he was anxious and he made a mistake.
我再举另外一个，这个在创世纪的16章啊，
Let's look at another example in Genesis 16.
这个16章在这边是提到有一个长期在等候神的人呐、
So Genesis 16, it talks about someone who was waiting for a long time after God's timing.
神对他的应许结果时间到，可是还没来达
And
成。
God has given them the promise, but yet his time was not fulfilled
这
yet.
是指着谁呢？
Who are we talking
这
about?
是指着亚伯兰娶夏甲的这件事情。
So here we are looking at the story of how how he took in Hagar.
这是以人为的意识来要完成神的意思。
So here we see how Abraham took Hagar as his wife, and he was doing it according his own human will.
我们来看一下创世纪的16章
Let's look at Genesis 16,
第2节开始。
starting from verse 2.
创世纪16章的第2节，
Genesis 16, verse 2.
这个撒来对亚伯兰说：“神使我不能生育，求你和我的使女同房，或者我可以因他来得孩子。”亚伯兰听从撒来的话，3节。于是亚伯兰的妻子撒来将使女埃及人夏甲给了丈夫为妾。那时亚伯兰在迦南已经住了10年。
Verse 3.
刚才我们所看的这一段
So the verses that we have just read,
就是提到用人的意思要来完成神的意思。
so over here we see how human will go over the will of God.
本来神应许要让亚伯兰来生下后代，
In fact, it was a promise of God that Abraham will have descendants.
结果等了很久
But yet they waited for such a long time,
这件事情都没办法去实现
and yet it never got fulfilled.
那变成这种考验成为很严重的考验了。
So then the promise actually became a great trial for them.
所以到最后就用人的意思了。
So then they exercised their own human will.
这个撒来就用他的这个使女来代替他生儿女
So we see how Sarah, how she offered up her maid to replace herself and to give her maid to her husband as his wife.
所以从这件事情也告诉我们一件事实：
So from this story, it also let us understand a fact.
不要用人意去看成是神意
Do not use your own human will to take over the plan of God.
我们懂得依靠神，你要本着信心去依靠神啊，
If you talk about relying upon God, you must exercise your faith.
不要去超过于对神的信心的一种承诺。
That is to say, you must exercise your faith and not let your will transcend over the plan and the promise of God.
你以为神把你忘了，
Because you think that God has forgotten about
这
you.
是你的想法，
But that is your mentality.
所以不可以用自己的做法要完成神的做法。
That is to say, you must not exercise your own will and let it transcend over the will of God.
所以这件事情呢，也让亚伯兰的家产生了长时间的一种纷争啊。
So because of this matter, it caused a great division in the family of Abraham.
再来我再提一个事实了哈，
And next, I would like to raise a fact
就是人在物质丰盛的时候，
that man, in terms of the abundance of our material
甚至
lives,
工作顺利的时候，
and in terms of our career being smooth sailing,
或者事业有成的时候，
or perhaps we are successful in our
也
careers,
许家庭蒙恩的时候，
and also our family is very blessed.
应该这是一件很美好的事情。
And indeed, it looks like it is a very blessed and blissful situation,
可是神有他的作为，
but yet God has His work.
所以神也借着一个人他的个人生活、家庭生活来对他考验。
So God, He will try the faith of a person from their own personal life and their own family life.
那这个人是谁？
Who is this person?
约伯。
And he is Job.
约伯他原本家庭幸福美满，
When we look at Job, in the beginning, his family was very blessed.
结果也因着撒旦来控告，
But because of the accusation of Satan,
所以在撒旦的控告之下，就造成了约伯全身甚至那个家庭这个家破人亡。
and because of the accusation of Satan, we find that the family of Job was destroyed along with his own health.
所以在约伯记的1章的第1节开始
So starting from chapter 1 of the book of Job,
就描述到他的信仰生活以及个人的家庭生活。
it describes his personal faith and also his family life.
所以呢，从约伯他的考验
So therefore, from the trials that is endured by Job,
也告诉我们一件事实：
it also allowed us to understand a fact
当我们在依靠神的这种生活的时候，
that when we are living a life of complete reliance upon God,
你有没有这种属灵的真智慧啊？
do you have the true wisdom that comes from God?
如果你有懂得这种属灵的真智慧的话，
If you truly have the true wisdom from God,
你就会得胜于撒旦的控告之下。
then you are able to overcome the accusation that comes from Satan.
所以约伯他遭受这么严重的打击，
So over here we see how how he was severely attacked by Satan,
他个人家中的损失、财产的损失，
and from the assault of Satan, he lost his personal wealth and family,
包括他这个各方面的损失啊。
and he lost everything.
但是呢，约伯他有信心，
But yet, Job, he has
他
faith,
没有被撒旦控告来被击倒，
and he was not struck down by the mere accusation of Satan,
因为他知道这个赏赐在于神啊。
because he knows that the reward comes from God,
那收取的也是神啊。
that God is also the one who takes away.
约伯他更知道
Job, he understood this fact,
说神的名是应当称颂的。
that the name of the Lord should be blessed.
所以像这些都是看到约伯个人在属灵的智慧追求上没有被撒旦击倒。
So from the story of Job, we can understand in terms of his pursuit of spiritual wisdom, he was not struck down by Satan.
甚至你在约伯记里头，你会看到他的朋友原本要来安慰勉励约伯，
And then from the book of Job, we also saw the friends of Job who actually come with the intention to comfort and also to encourage Job.
说真的，这些朋友也可以说在那个痛处 那个伤口上在撒盐一样啊。
But in fact, we look at these three friends of Job, they were just pouring salt upon his wounds.
安慰本来家庭这个受到伤害打击，安慰是正常的事情。
Of course, it is normal to comfort and console the other person over their family loss,
结果所讲的太严重了。
but yet their words are too harsh.
今天如果约伯没有那种属灵的真智慧的话，
So today, if Job does not have that true spiritual wisdom,
我看约伯到最后一定会被打倒啊。
I think that perhaps at the end, Job will definitely be struck down completely.
但是因为约伯他有真智慧啊，
But because Job, he has true wisdom,
所以约伯他最后讲了一句话，
and that is why Job, at the end of the day, he spoke and uttered this verse.
我们看一下约伯记的42章
Let's turn to Job 42,
第5节，
verse 5.
第5节，
Verse 5.
我从前风闻有你，现在亲眼看见你。
Verse 5. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you.
这是证明约伯他有属灵的真智慧。
So that further clarifies the fact that Job has true spiritual wisdom.
他如果没有这种真智慧的话，说真的，他这一被打击，真的会被打垮。
So if Job did not possess true spiritual wisdom, he naturally will be struck down by all the events.
所以所以这个约伯他这种真智慧，真的值得我们去学习啊。
So that is why the true spiritual wisdom of Job is worthy of our emulation today.
那在约拿书的1章3节里头也有记载啊。
And also in the book of Jonah, chapter 1, it also mentions
这个约拿他没有把神的意思看为重要了。
And so Jonah, he did not take seriously in terms of the matters of God.
他把神的旨意把它抛开啊，不是他的意见啊。
And then he cast aside the will of God and belittled the will of God.
神本来要约拿去那个尼尼微城去传福音啊，
And in fact, the will of God is to ask Jonah to go and preach in the town of Nineveh.
可是这个约拿他不听话啊，
But yet Jonah, he was rebellious and disobedient.
他要逃到他西呀、
And he wants to flee to Tarshish.
这是他的自己的意思。
That is Jonah's own human will.
所以约拿呢，他也没有那种真智慧啊。
So therefore, from here we can see that Jonah, he does not have true spiritual wisdom at all.
所以刚才我们提过了4个啊。
So the four stories that we have just talked about,
如果你有真智慧的这种人生的生活，
if you have true spiritual wisdom in your life,
你就像约伯在危难中还懂得靠神。
then you'll be likened to Job, that you know how to trust in the Lord in terms of your anguish.
你还会像约伯说：“风闻有你，
And you'll be likened to Job, that I have heard of you in the past,
今天我亲眼见到神了。
but now I truly see the face of God. ”
所以这个就是一个真智慧的人生表现出不一样的地方。
So that tell us the manifestation of true spiritual wisdom.
所以从今天我们所学习的这些道理来看，
So from the truth that we have studied today from the words of God,
我们在一生中看懂、看明白神的考验是什么吗？
so in terms of our walk with God, do we truly understand the trials that come from Him?
我们也不能只有靠着人的这种血肉膀臂啊。
And we should not just rely upon our mere human will.
你如果靠着人的膀臂，你就少靠神了。
Because if you trust in the flesh of man as your strength, then you will not trust in God.
所以我们应该要深深思考。
So this is something that we must deeply ponder upon.
那今天呢，我们要做成决定啊。
So today we must make this life decision.
今天我们要思考一下，
We must also meditate and ponder,
我到底依靠谁？
who should I trust?
是靠我的智慧呢，
Do I trust in my own
还是
knowledge?
靠我的膀臂呢？
Or do I trust in my own strength?
还是像以色列百姓心远离神呢？
Or am I likened to the Israelites that my heart is far away from God?
这是值得 我们深深思考的地方。
And this is definitely something for us to think about.
我们一起唱诗
Let us sing hymn
394首。
394.